Your kids are banned from the pool, effective immediately. Marcus Hensley's words cut through the humid Texas air like a blade. He didn't flinch, didn't even bother to hide the smug curl of his mouth as he slid the official-looking letter across the patio table. Behind him, the splash of water and the laughter of other families carried on, but his voice made it sound like the entire neighborhood had stopped to listen. My son clutched his towel tighter. My daughter's eyes darted to the oak tree that shaded the pool, the place where their mother used to sit, cheering them on. You think this is over rules? I tapped the letter once, slowly, letting it hang between us. Marcus, you signed off on a maintenance fund that doesn't even exist. His jaw shifted, just barely, but it was enough. I saw it. He wasn't expecting me to know. Not yet. That flicker of fear buried under layers of arrogance was the only confirmation I needed. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. My name's David Turner, I said, steady as stone. I build cities. I design bridges that carry families safely home. And I've lived here long enough to know this land better than anyone sitting in your boardroom. I leaned closer. You've chosen the wrong man to try to intimidate. His smile faltered. For the first time, the HOA president's eyes flickered toward the oak tree, as if he knew it meant something to me he couldn't touch. The truth was, that tree carried more weight than he'd ever understand. My late wife used to sit beneath it every summer afternoon, her sunglasses pushed up on her head, clapping and laughing as the kids splashed in the deep end. It was the only place in this neighborhood where her voice still seemed to echo. When she passed, I promised my children and myself that nothing would erase her memory. The pool wasn't just water. It was a thread of her life, stitched into ours, holding us together. And Marcus thought a piece of paper could sever it. I picked up the letter, feeling the cheap ink smear against my thumb. You think you can dictate who belongs here? My wife helped pay for this pool before you ever dreamed of being president. My son shifted closer to me, his towel brushing against my arm. My daughter's lip trembled, but she kept her chin up. Her eyes locked on Marcus as if she wanted him to see the weight of what he'd done. They weren't just losing a place to swim, they were losing the last living reminder of their mother's love for this community. And that was something I couldn't let stand. Where are you watching from? I ask. Because this fight isn't just mine, it belongs to every family that's ever been pushed around by a board that forgot who it was supposed to serve. This isn't about chlorine or tiles or water rights, it's about legacy. It's about standing in the shadow of that oak tree and saying, not today, not ever. I folded the letter once, then twice, and slid it back across the table to Marcus. My voice stayed calm, but there was no mistaking the steel underneath. You made a mistake. You chose the wrong father. And soon, the whole neighborhood's going to see it. The laughter from the pool carried on as if nothing had happened, but I could feel the shift in the air. The first crack in Marcus's armor had formed, and though he didn't know it yet, that tiny fracture was going to bring his entire empire crashing down. 2 mornings later, I found another envelope shoved crookedly into my mailbox, its flap barely sealed. The paper inside carried Marcus Hensley's name at the bottom, stamped in the same cheap ink as before. This time it wasn't about the pool. According to him, my lawn was in serious violation of community standards, overgrown, unsightly, threatening property values. I stared at the neat lines of grass at my feet, trimmed only yesterday, and felt the heat rise in my chest. It wasn't about aesthetics. It was about control. I wasn't the only one. That afternoon, while I sat on the front porch, watching my kids ride bikes up and down the cul-de-sac, I saw a neighbor across the street, Mrs. Reynolds, clutching her own letter with trembling hands. She waved me over, her face pale. Her supposed violation? A bird feeder. Marcus had declared it a hazard, claiming it attracted pests. She whispered that she couldn't afford the fine he'd threatened, not on her fixed income. As we spoke, her voice shook, and she kept glancing over her shoulder, as if Marcus himself might appear. I leaned against the railing, taking it all in the pattern forming right in front of me. Letters piling up, targeting those least likely to fight back. Parents with noisy kids. Elderly residents with small comforts. A young couple down the block had their welcome mat declared a trip hazard. Each complaint sounded more absurd than the last, but every one carried the same sharp edge of intimidation. It wasn't governance. It was harassment. The worst part was the silence. People whispered about Marcus in hushed tones, but few dared speak out loud. Fear had settled into this neighborhood, like humidity clinging to the air. I could see it in the way folks pulled their curtains shut when the HOA patrol made rounds, or how they nodded politely at Marcus in public, but muttered curses behind closed doors. It reminded me of hairline fractures in concrete, small, almost invisible at first, but growing with each passing day until the whole structure threatened to collapse. I sat back on my porch steps and thought of my wife. She had believed in community, in people standing shoulder to shoulder for something bigger than themselves. She would have seen through Marcus's false authority in an instant. The oak tree by the pool wasn't the only symbol of her memory. It was every neighbor she had welcomed, every gathering she had helped organize, every quiet act of kindness she left behind. And now, watching the fear ripple across our block, I realized this wasn't just about my kids' right to swim. This was about whether any of us still had a say in the place we called home. Later that week, I witnessed Marcus in action. From my driveway, I saw him march up to the Ramirez family's porch, clipboard in hand. Their teenage son had parked his truck slightly crooked, one tire kissing the edge of the curb. Marcus photographed it like it was a crime scene. When Mr. Ramirez stepped outside, confusion written all over his face. Marcus didn't even let him speak. He just pointed to the clipboard and left without a word. The boy's shoulders slumped as if he'd been caught doing something terrible, though the only crime was parking a foot too far to the right. That was the moment I knew this pattern wasn't coincidence. It was deliberate, systematic. He picked targets carefully, ensuring each felt alone, too small to fight back, divide and conquer. That was Marcus's game. I turned to my children playing in the yard, their laughter ringing against the quiet fear pressing in from every other house. My jaw tightened. This wasn't going to be solved by a single confrontation at the pool. It would take something bigger, something that showed every neighbor they weren't isolated. We needed each other. As the sun dipped low and the street lamps flickered on, I walked back to the porch and sat down, staring at the second letter in my hands. Marcus thought he could suffocate us one by one, but he had overlooked one thing. I built bridges for a living, and now I was going to build one between my neighbors. Patricia Lopez stood at the end of the meeting room table, clutching her pen so tightly her knuckles turned white. It was a small windowless room in the HOA office, painted beige and lit with buzzing fluorescent lights. Marcus sat at the head of the table, barking out new restrictions to the handful of board members as if he were a king issuing decrees. I'd slipped in as an observer, allowed by the bylaws, though Marcus scowled the moment he saw me. Patricia avoided my eyes at first, focusing on her notepad. But I noticed the way her lips pressed into a thin line each time Marcus spoke. He rattled off about raising fines for repeat offenders, doubling penalties for late dues, even suggesting cameras at the pool entrance. With every word, Patricia's pen tapped against the paper fast, nervous, like a heartbeat racing out of control. When Marcus announced that families with non-traditional title ownership would need to submit new paperwork to keep access to amenities, I felt my pulse hammer in my ears. That was aimed directly at me. My wife's name was still on the original deed, though I had been the legal co-owner for years. It was a loophole he was trying to weaponize. I glanced at Patricia. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her foot tapping against the floor. For just a second, her eyes flicked to mine. There it was, hesitation, doubt, guilt. She knew what Marcus was doing. The conflict was written all over her face. She pressed her palm against her temple as if she wanted to stop the words from entering her ears. The meeting dragged on, filled with Marcus's self-important monologues. Patricia's body language told me everything words couldn't. Her shoulders slumped when he bragged about cleaning up the neighborhood. She bit her lip when he mocked the Ramirez family's parking violation. She scribbled furiously when he claimed Mrs. Reynolds' bird feeder was a rodent attractor. Every gesture was a crack in her armor. When the meeting adjourned, Marcus strutted out first, tossing a glance over his shoulder at me like a warning. Patricia lingered behind, gathering papers with trembling hands. I walked past her, close enough to see the sweat beading at her hairline. Her pen rolled off the table and clattered to the floor. She bent to pick it up, and for just a moment she whispered under her breath, so low I almost didn't catch it. "It isn't right." Those 3 words hit harder than Marcus's entire speech. She didn't look at me again, just shoved the papers into her bag and hurried out, her heels clicking fast against the tile. But I'd heard enough. Patricia was caught between loyalty and conscience, between Marcus's grip and her own integrity. And that made her important. Outside, the night air was heavy with the smell of freshly cut grass. I breathed deep, trying to calm the storm building inside me. Marcus was tightening the noose, but Patricia had just proven he wasn't invincible. Doubt was spreading inside his circle, whether he realized it or not. Back home, I sat beneath the porch light, watching my kids chase each other across the lawn. Their laughter carried through the dark, but my mind was back in that sterile meeting room. Patricia's eyes, her clenched jaw, her whispered confession, they told me she was on the edge of breaking. And when she did, she might be the key to dismantling Marcus's power. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the oak tree silhouetted against the stars. My wife had always believed people were stronger together, that even the quietest voice could change everything. Maybe Patricia didn't know it yet, but her voice could tip the balance of this entire fight. The next escalation came on a Saturday morning, when the sound of a hammer echoed across my street. I stepped outside and saw two men in bright vests drilling holes into the patch of sidewalk that ran alongside my yard. An orange cone tipped over, rolling into the gutter. My kids stopped their bike ride and stared. When I asked what was happening, one of the workers shrugged and said they'd been ordered by the HOA president to mark property compliance adjustments. Moments later, Marcus appeared. At the curb, clipboard in hand, that smug expression plastered across his face. "Turner," he called, waving the clipboard, "your fence is out of compliance with setback rules. You'll need to rebuild it 3 feet back." His voice carried across the cul-de-sac, loud enough for every neighbor to hear. My fence had stood in the same place since the house was built. I knew the original plans, I had them framed in my office. But Marcus wasn't interested in facts. He wanted a spectacle, a public humiliation. Mrs. Reynolds peeked through her curtains. The Ramirez boy froze on his front steps, watching. Marcus wasn't just targeting me anymore. He was making an example out of me. He wanted the neighborhood to see what happened if you pushed back. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to breathe. "That fence is original construction," I said, steady but sharp. "You don't have the authority to change it without city approval." Marcus smirked, scribbling something on his clipboard. "We'll see how the fines look when they show up in your mailbox." He turned and strode off, leaving the workers confused and my neighbors shaken. I crouched beside my kids, who were watching wide-eyed. My daughter whispered, "Are they taking our house?" My heart twisted. That was Marcus's real power, the fear he planted in families who didn't know their rights. The men packed up their equipment after a quick phone call, clearly uncomfortable with the scene. I knew Marcus hadn't secured permits. He was bluffing, hoping to scare me into compliance. But I also knew this was more than a personal attack. It was a test of how far he could push the neighborhood before someone broke. That night, I paced the living room, letter after letter spread across the coffee table, my violations, Mrs. Reynolds' bird feeder fine, the Ramirez parking citation, the young couple's welcome mat warning. The pattern was undeniable, each one crafted to isolate, to silence, to make people feel like they stood alone. I pressed my palms against the table, feeling the paper crinkle under my weight. Marcus was escalating, and he wouldn't stop until someone forced him to. My engineering training taught me one thing about pressure. Unchecked, it always found a breaking point. He was driving this community straight toward collapse. Through the window, the oak tree swayed in the evening breeze, its branches casting shadows across the pool fence. I thought of my wife again, her faith in people, her belief that no bully could control a united neighborhood. Marcus was betting on fear. I was betting on something stronger. The following week, I found myself at the city planning office. I hadn't gone there looking for ammunition. I just wanted clarity, to confirm what I already suspected about Marcus's so-called authority. The receptionist, a young man with sleeves rolled up and a tired smile, directed me to a public records terminal tucked against the far wall. The screen glowed pale blue, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the otherwise quiet room. I typed in our subdivision's name and scrolled through archived permits, zoning maps, and maintenance allocations. It didn't take long before I saw it, an entry for Community Pool Renovation Fund from 3 years ago. A sizable budget had been approved, allocated, and signed by the HOA board at the time. But the file showed no completion records, no inspection reports, no disbursements. It was as if the pool repairs had existed only on paper. My chest tightened as I leaned closer to the screen. Marcus had waved that fund around during community meetings, bragging about improvements, promising safety upgrades, talking about how the HOA had invested in the future of the neighborhood. Yet the city had no evidence that a single dollar had been spent, No filings, no approvals, nothing. I printed the page and slid it into my folder. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like holding proof of something everyone had sensed but couldn't name. Marcus wasn't just nitpicking lawns and fences. He was siphoning money meant to protect families, lying to the very people who trusted him. As I walked out, the sun hit me hard, hot and relentless against the concrete steps. My hands shook, not from fear but from adrenaline. This was it, the leverage. Not some rumor, not a complaint from a frustrated neighbor, hard evidence of neglect and possible fraud. Back at home, I laid the printout on my kitchen table. My kids wandered in, sweaty from biking, and glanced at it. I quickly covered it with my hand. They didn't need to carry this weight. Not yet. But I couldn't shake the image of Marcus's smug face at the pool, his voice echoing across the patio as he announced bans and fines. I could already imagine how he'd react if this information surfaced. He'd deny it. He'd twist it. He'd paint me as a troublemaker trying to stir unrest, but even Marcus couldn't erase a public record. That evening, I sat on the porch again, folder tucked beside me. Neighbors passed by, offering tight smiles and quick waves. I noticed something in their eyes, weariness, resignation, but also flickers of hope when they glanced at me. Word had spread about my run-ins with Marcus. People were watching, waiting to see if I'd stand or crumble. I exhaled slowly. I couldn't fight this battle in secret. This wasn't about one father protecting his kids anymore. It was about an entire neighborhood shackled by fear. And now, I had the first real crack in Marcus's wall. The oak tree stood tall against the twilight, its branches reaching over the pool fence like arms stretched in defiance. My wife's laughter seemed to whisper through the leaves. For the first time since she passed, I felt like I was moving towards something she'd be proud of, not just defending our children, but defending the place she'd poured her heart into. This discovery wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a much bigger fight. And I wasn't alone anymore. The next HOA letter arrived on a Tuesday evening, slid halfway under my door like some coward's threat. My kids brought it to me while I was in the kitchen, their faces pale as if they were holding a snake. Marcus had upped the ante this time, claiming my dues were delinquent. According to him, I owed 3 months of back payments, plus late fees. I knew without a doubt it was false. My bank statements, neatly filed in a folder in my office, proved I'd paid on time every time. I sat at the table, holding the letter between my fingers. The kids watched silently. My daughter finally asked, "Dad, are we going to lose the house?" My throat tightened. That was exactly what Marcus wanted, fear that seeped into our walls, into our children, into the very bones of our home. I folded the paper slowly, slipped it back into the envelope, and forced a calm smile. "We're not losing anything," I told them, but inside, I felt the pressure building. That night, as the cicadas droned outside, I logged into my bank account and scrolled through payments. Each one lined up perfectly, dues paid, receipts stored, no gaps, no mistakes. Marcus wasn't sloppy, he was strategic. He knew most families wouldn't dig deep, wouldn't challenge authority, wouldn't risk the embarrassment of standing up in front of the board, but I wasn't most families. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazy circles above me. It wasn't just my reputation or my kids' pool access at stake anymore. Marcus had crossed into financial lies, the kind that could ruin credit scores, wreck families, and drive people out of their homes. That was the line I couldn't ignore. He had dragged the fight into territory where my skills, my precision, my insistence on evidence, my refusal to accept faulty structures mattered more than ever. The next morning, I walked down the block and found Mr. Ramirez, working under the hood of his truck. He wiped his hands on a rag and nodded toward me. "Got one too?" he asked, eyes heavy with frustration. He pulled a crumpled notice from his back pocket, an almost identical claim about dues, only this time accusing him of late payment from 6 months earlier. We compared notes right there in his driveway, the smell of oil thick in the air. My stomach churned. Marcus wasn't targeting just me. He was fabricating a paper trail, manufacturing debts that didn't exist. That was when the urgency hit me full force. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was theft by intimidation. I thought of Patricia in that sterile meeting room, pen trembling in her hand, her whispered, "It isn't right." She had seen the inside of this corruption. Maybe she didn't know the full extent, but she had glimpsed enough to make her uneasy. And if Marcus was creating fake delinquency claims, Patricia's conscience wouldn't hold out much longer. I walked back home with a knot in my gut, the Texas sun pressing down like a weight. My kids were in the yard, kicking a soccer ball back and forth, but I could see the tension in their shoulders. They heard more than I wanted them to. They felt the stress I tried to bury. I sat on the porch steps and let the ball roll to my feet. My son looked at me, wide-eyed. "What are we going to do, Dad?" I picked up the ball and held it in my hands, the leather warm from the Sunday. "We're going to fight smart," I said quietly. My wife's voice echoed in my memory, steady and certain. "Stand your ground, David. Don't let fear win." The truth was clear now. Marcus wasn't just abusing his power. He was threatening the foundation of the neighborhood itself. And if we didn't act soon, he'd drive good families out one by one until nothing was left but silence and obedience. The time for hesitation was gone. I had the proof of missing funds. I had the evidence of false delinquency claims, and I had neighbors beginning to realize they weren't alone. The urgency wasn't just personal anymore, it was communal. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that this fight was about to explode. 2 days later, I spotted Patricia in the grocery store parking lot, balancing a paper bag against her hip while fumbling for her keys. She froze when she saw me, eyes darting toward the ground as if hoping I'd pass without speaking. But I couldn't let her slip away again. I walked over, steady but calm, and said her name softly. She hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. "David, you shouldn't talk to me here," she murmured, glancing around as though Marcus might step out from behind a parked car. Her hands trembled, and the bag nearly tipped. I caught it before it spilled. That simple act seemed to break something in her. Her shoulders slumped, the tension in her face softening into exhaustion. We leaned against my truck, the late afternoon sun throwing long shadows across the pavement. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, almost in a whisper, she admitted, "Marcus has been altering board records. Minutes, financial reports, he rewrites them after meetings. He says it's just to streamline things, but I know it's wrong." Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, full of guilt and fear. "I've been signing them anyway." The weight of her confession hit me like a punch. Altering records wasn't just shady politics, it was the backbone of every fine, every false delinquency, every fabricated claim. Patricia's unease in that sterile meeting room made sense now. She had been carrying the burden of complicity, trapped between loyalty and conscience. I didn't push her, I just listened, nodding slowly, letting her unspool the knots she'd been holding inside. She told me how Marcus pressured her, how he justified each change as technical corrections, how he made her feel like the neighborhood would collapse without his leadership. But every word cracked her loyalty further, until she admitted the truth. He's not protecting anyone, he's protecting himself. The sound of carts rattling over asphalt filled the silence that followed. Patricia wiped at her eyes quickly, trying to compose herself. "I don't know what to do," she said. "If I go against him, he'll ruin me. But if I keep helping him, I'll never forgive myself." I rested my hand on the truck's hood, steadying my own anger. "You've already done something," I told her. "You've told me the truth. That matters." She looked away, but a faint spark of relief crossed her face. For the first time, she wasn't carrying it alone. As she loaded her groceries into the car, she slipped a folded sheet of paper into my hand. "Board meeting minutes," she whispered. "The ones Marcus altered last month. Don't ask me for more yet, I need time." Then she shut her trunk and drove off, leaving me standing in the heat with proof pressed against my palm. I climbed into my truck, the paper crinkling in my pocket. My heart pounded, not with fear this time, but with momentum. Patricia had crossed the line. She wasn't just a conflicted witness anymore. She was an ally, one who had just given me the key to tearing down Marcus's facade. Driving home, I thought of my wife again. She would have told me people like Patricia were worth fighting for, that sometimes the quietest voices carried the most power. Now, with her help, the cracks in Marcus's control were widening. And soon, the whole neighborhood would see the truth. I spread Patricia's altered minutes across my dining table, the paper catching the glow of the overhead light. My hands traced each line, comparing them to the notes I'd scribbled during the meeting I'd attended. The discrepancies jumped off the page, budgets inflated, fines exaggerated, maintenance funds marked as allocated, with no sign of actual work. Marcus had built his entire empire on a foundation of lies. And now, thanks to Patricia, I had something solid to expose him. But evidence alone wasn't enough. Marcus thrived on isolating people, making each family believe they were the only ones being crushed. If I simply confronted him with the papers, he'd twist it, deny it, bury me under technical jargon. No, the power wasn't in holding the truth. It was in showing everyone the truth, all at once. That was the only way to break the fear strangling this neighborhood. I spent the evening sketching out a plan, my engineering training guiding me as if I were drafting a new bridge. Every detail mattered: timing, delivery, structure. I listed names of neighbors who'd been targeted: Reynolds, Ramirez, Chen, Patel. Each carried a piece of Marcus's abuse. Together, they formed a pattern no one could ignore. The next step was outreach. I started with the Ramirezes. We met in their garage, the smell of motor oil and fresh paint lingering in the air. I laid out the minutes Patricia had given me, careful not to overwhelm them. "You're not alone," I said. "Your so-called violations aren't isolated. He's manufacturing them." Mr. Ramirez's jaw tightened as he looked over the pages. His wife crossed her arms, anger replacing fear. They agreed to talk to neighbors they trusted. From there, the momentum grew. At Mrs. Reynolds's kitchen table, she clutched my hand with tears in her eyes, whispering that she'd felt powerless for months. At the Chen's backyard cookout, I quietly passed around copies of the discrepancies, watching eyes widen as connections formed. Each conversation was a brick laid in the structure of resistance. By the end of the week, whispers had turned into conversations, and conversations into quiet commitments. People weren't ready to storm the HOA office, not yet, but the seed was planted. They began to see themselves not as victims, but as a community with a voice. Late one night, after the mentry, kids were asleep, I sat on the porch with the oak tree's silhouette stretching across the pool fence. The weight of the plan settled over me, heavy but steady. My wife's memory lingered in the leaves above me, reminding me why this mattered. I wasn't just fighting Marcus. I was building something stronger than him: unity. By the time the weekend rolled around, the quiet murmurs had shifted into something firmer. Neighbors who once avoided each other's eyes now leaned close in hushed conversations, comparing notes, trading stories, realizing how wide Marcus's net of control had spread. It was time to move from whispers to action. I knew preparation mattered more than confrontation. If we went in unorganized, Marcus would tear us apart. But if we stood together, with proof and voices united, he wouldn't have anywhere to hide. I started in my garage, setting up a folding table with stacks of copied minutes, city fund records, and violation notices I'd collected. My engineering mind kicked in. I arranged them into categories, each labeled with sticky notes, like assembling blueprints for a structure. My kids wandered in, curious. I told them simply, "We're building something to protect everyone." They didn't fully understand, but they saw the determination on my face and nodded solemnly. That evening, the Ramirezes hosted a small gathering in their backyard. String lights hung from the fence, glowing softly against the night. People filtered in quietly: Mrs. Reynolds, with her bird feeder violation notice in hand, the Chens carrying a folder of letters, the Patels clutching photographs of their cracked driveway Marcus had blamed on them. Each neighbor came with evidence, anger, and, for the first time, a sense of belonging. I laid Patricia's altered minutes in the center of the patio table. The group leaned in, voices sharp with disbelief, as they saw the proof for themselves. "He's rewriting everything," Mr. Chen said, shaking his head. No wonder the numbers never matched. Murmurs turned into outrage, outrage into resolve. One by one, they began sharing their own stories, moments of intimidation, threats of fines, false claims of delinquency. And as each spoke, the others nodded, realizing they weren't alone. When the voices quieted, I explained the next step: a petition. According to the bylaws, a majority of homeowners could demand a special meeting to vote on removing board members. Marcus had been banking on fear, but the rules he manipulated could also be his undoing. "We don't need to outshout him," I said. "We just need to outnumber him." Mrs. Reynolds raised her trembling hand first. "I'll sign." Her voice wavered, but her eyes held steady. Then the Ramirezes, then the Chens, then others around the table. Pens scratched against paper under the glow of string lights, and with each signature, the petition grew heavier with meaning. It wasn't just ink, it was courage. When I collected the sheet at the end of the night, my hands tingled with adrenaline. For the first time, Marcus's power seemed brittle, like glass under pressure. Patricia's courage had given me the tools, and my neighbor's bravery was turning those tools into action. Walking home, I carried the petition close to my chest. The oak tree swayed in the night breeze, its branches reaching toward the pool. My wife's voice seemed to echo through the rustling leaves, reminding me that this fight was never about one family, it was about all of us. And soon, Marcus would learn that no president, no matter how smug, could stand against a united community. The petition lay on my dining table, every line filled with the names of neighbors who had finally found their voices. I read through them twice, then slid the pages into a manila folder. My heart pounded, as if I were preparing for trial. In a way, I was. The confrontation wasn't tomorrow, it was tonight. The HOA board had scheduled a routine meeting in the community hall, and with the petition in hand, we were about to change the script. I arrived early, folder tucked under my arm, the old oak tree visible in the distance through the window as twilight settled across the pool. The hall smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet, rows of folding chairs lined up in stiff formation. A few board members shuffled papers at the front table, chatting casually, oblivious to the storm that was about to break. Neighbors began to trickle in, Mrs. Reynolds gripping her cane but walking tall, the Ramirezes whispering encouragement to each other, the Chens holding a thick folder of correspondence Marcus had sent them. They filled the chairs quietly, but I could feel the energy building, a hum of defiance growing stronger with each body that entered the room. Marcus arrived last, of course, striding in with his clipboard under his arm and a smirk plastered on his face. He tapped the microphone once, the sound sharp and grating. "Let's make this quick," he said, already scanning the room as if tallying who dared to show up. His eyes landed on me in the second row. The smirk faltered for half a second, then returned even sharper. As the meeting began, Marcus rattled off his usual agenda: new fines, increased restrictions, proposed amendments that gave the board more control. His voice carried the arrogance of someone convinced no one would challenge him, but tonight, he was wrong. When he paused to shuffle papers, I stood. The chair legs screeched against the floor, drawing every eye in the room. "Before we move on," I said, my voice steady though adrenaline surged through me, "the homeowners have a petition." I held the folder high, then walked it to the front. Marcus's smirk cracked. He didn't reach for it. Patricia did, her hands shaking slightly as she accepted the folder, her eyes flicking toward me with the faintest nod. A murmur rippled through the crowd. People leaned forward, whispering, waiting. Marcus cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "This is out of order." "It's not," Patricia interrupted quietly, her voice thin but firm. "The bylaws allow it." She placed the petition squarely on the table in front of her. Marcus's glare could have burned through steel, but she didn't look away. The neighbors around me straightened in their chairs. For months, they'd been silent, afraid. But now the rules were on their side, and Marcus couldn't shout them down. I looked around the room, catching their eyes, giving small nods. The preparation was done. The positioning was set. Tonight wasn't the fight itself, it was the moment we stepped onto the battlefield, shoulder to shoulder. I sat back down, pulse racing. Marcus shuffled his clipboard, his mouth twitching, scrambling for a way to twist this. But the petition sat in plain view, undeniable. The balance of power had shifted, and he knew it. Outside the hall, the cicadas screamed into the night. The oak tree's shadow stretched across the pool fence, a silent reminder of why I was here. My wife had always said community wasn't about the rules on paper, it was about the people who lived under them. And tonight, those people had finally stood up. The community hall was packed. Folding chairs scraped against the floor as more neighbors crowded in, standing along the walls when the seats ran out. The air buzzed with whispers and restless energy. Marcus sat at the head table, his clipboard clutched tighter than usual, his smile thinner. Patricia sat 2 chairs down, posture stiff, a stack of papers in front of her like a shield. I could see the tension in her jaw, but her eyes, those flicked toward me, steady, resolved. The gavel cracked against the wood. Marcus leaned into the microphone. "This meeting will proceed as usual," he announced, his voice straining for control. But the crowd wasn't the same weary group he was used to. They were alert, united, leaning forward in anticipation. I stood before he could launch into his agenda. "The homeowners demand a vote," my voice carried, amplified not by a microphone but by the collective silence that followed. Every eye turned toward me. Behind me, Mrs. Reynolds gripped her cane like a weapon. The Ramirezes nodded firmly. The Chens held up their folder of letters. It wasn't just me standing there, it was all of us. Marcus sneered. "You don't dictate how this board operates." He tapped his clipboard, papers rustling like nervous fingers. "This petition is meaningless, invalid." Patricia cleared her throat, and the microphone squealed. Her voice wavered at first, but grew stronger. The bylaws allow it. Section 7, Article 2. She slid the petition across the table, her hands trembling only slightly. The sound of paper on wood echoed louder than Marcus's gavel had moments earlier. Gasps spread through the room. People craned their necks, whispering, murmuring, feeding on each other's courage. Marcus's face darkened. "You're making a mistake," he hissed, his voice breaking the mask of authority. "No," I said, stepping closer to the front. "You did, when you falsified records, invented fines, and lied about funds meant for this community." My voice sharpened, the weight of every sleepless night pressing against each word. "You've turned neighbors into enemies, families into targets. That ends tonight." The crowd erupted not in chaos but in support. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then building, filling the hall until the walls seemed to vibrate with it. Patricia straightened in her chair, shoulders squared as if the sound itself had lifted her. Marcus slammed his clipboard down, his voice cracking as he tried to shout over the noise. "You people have no idea how hard I've worked. You worked for yourself, Mrs." Reynolds interrupted, rising shakily to her feet. Her voice, though aged, carried steel. "We trusted you, and you betrayed us." The room roared again, a tidal wave of voices that drowned out Marcus completely. Patricia picked up the gavel, her hands steadier now. "The petition stands," she declared. "We will proceed to a vote of no confidence." Her tone had shifted. She was no longer Marcus's secretary, she was the voice of the people in that room. I turned to face the crowd, heart pounding, the oak tree's silhouette flashing in my mind. This was the moment we'd built toward, the bridge I'd promised to construct. And as ballots were passed out, neighbors leaned forward eagerly, pens scratching, voices buzzing with determination. Marcus sat frozen, trapped by the very rules he had twisted. His smirk was gone, replaced by the dawning realization that his power was slipping through his fingers. He could glare, he could bluster, but he couldn't stop what had already begun. The hall filled with the sound of paper rustling, votes being cast. For the first time in months, the fear was gone. It had been replaced by something stronger, solidarity. The ballots were collected in a plain cardboard box, passed hand to hand through the crowded hall. The room fell into a tense hush as Patricia counted them one by one, her lips moving silently as she tallied. Marcus sat rigid in his chair, his eyes darting between her and the restless crowd, sweat glistening at his temples. My own pulse thundered in my ears, but beneath it was a steady calm. Whatever the outcome, the neighborhood had already broken free of fear. Finally, Patricia set down her pen and looked up. Her voice was clear, steady, stronger than I'd ever heard it. "By majority vote, the board removes Marcus Hensley from his position as HOA president, effective immediately." For a heartbeat, silence. Then the hall erupted. Applause crashed like a wave, neighbors clapping, cheering, some even standing. Mrs. Reynolds wiped a tear from her cheek. The Ramirez's clasped hands, relief, etched across their faces. Even the Chens, usually reserved, let out a triumphant shout. It was more than a vote, it was liberation. Marcus shot to his feet, face flushed red. "This is a sham. You'll regret this." His voice cracked, drowned out by the swell of voices around him. He slammed his clipboard onto the table and stormed toward the door, shoving past chairs as if the walls themselves had turned against him. The door slammed shut behind him, the echo swallowed by cheers. Patricia remained at the table, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion, but her eyes glimmering with relief. She tapped the gavel once, and the sound cut through the noise. "The neighborhood will appoint interim leadership until a new election is held," she said. "But tonight, we've taken back our community." I exhaled, the tension draining from my body. My kids, sitting near the back, grinned and waved when they caught my eye. They didn't fully grasp the mechanics of what had just happened, but they knew the pool and the oak tree beside it were safe again. My wife's memory would remain rooted in this place, untouched by Marcus's cruelty. As the crowd began to disperse, neighbors stopped me with handshakes, hugs, words of gratitude. "You showed us we weren't alone. We couldn't have done this without you." I shook my head each time. We did this together. Because that was the truth. I hadn't won this fight the community had. All I'd done was help them see their own strength. Later, I walked outside, the night air cool against my skin. The oak tree loomed dark and solid by the pool, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. I stood beneath it, looking up into its canopy, and for the first time in months, I felt at peace. My wife's laughter seemed to echo faintly through the leaves. Not as a memory fading, but as a promise kept. This battle was over, but the lesson would last. Marcus had taught us how fragile trust could be. But tonight, we had proven that unity was stronger than intimidation, stronger than lies, stronger than fear. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.